The dictionary definition of the word journalism is a profession of writing for papers, newspapers, magazines, or preparing news for broadcast. The operative word here is profession. Journalism is a job, much like a job in a bank or an investment firm, or perhaps with the government. But the professionals who do this job have become soft targets in our country, simply for doing their jobs. India has become increasingly unsafe for any journalist right now to ask a question or state a fact. With Sujat Bukhari's assassination yesterday, India has now lost a total of 48 journalists, over 77 media workers since 1992 on the line of duty. 3 in 2018 alone. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there's been no conviction in 33 of these cases. Statistics tell us that for the past 2 years, India has ranked among the countries with the highest number of journalist deaths. In 2016, the International Federation for Journalists listed India as the 8th most dangerous country for journalists. India has ranked 138 out of 180 countries in Freedom of Press Index, according to an annual report by Reporters Without Borders. Tonight we ask a very simple question. What do we need to do at this point? Civil society, fraternity and government, what do we need to do to fix this gaping wound on the breast of our democracy? Because remember, without journalism, you cannot have a democracy. Without the free press, you cannot have a free country. Without the free press, you will not have the truth. Simply what needs to be done to make sure we improve the quality of freedom of press and the protection we offer our journalists in this country. That's just the question we're asking. Joining me on the show, Gohar Gilani, senior journalist, Aarti Jarat, Manisha Priyam, Mr. N. Ram, Vinay Tiwari, Rahul Jalali, all senior journalists, and Jyoti Malhotra, editor of National Strategic Affairs of The Print, all senior journalists, no politicians on the show tonight. I welcome all of you to this conversation. It's a simple aim to put together a point-by-point list. Mr. N. Ram, I am going to start with you. What should we do, Mr. Ram? What should we demand from the government of the day to make sure that journalists are kept safe, because we can no longer afford to lose journalists in this manner?
I think the best safeguard would be for journalists to come together and show solidarity. Too often we make a token protest or a protest that lasts a day or two and then forget about it. So I think although the Editors Guild and other organizations do raise their voice against this, that has some influence, that does some good. I think there's a lack of sustained effort to come to the aid of those who are vulnerable or those who are attacked. So I think very often you need to raise the level of the actions. There must be protest actions. In certain cases, you could even call for boycott of ministers and so on. We attempted that during the campaign against the defamation bill of 1988, and the Rajiv Gandhi government was forced to withdraw it very quickly, simply because of this network of journalists around the country acting as one, more or less as one. That is missing today, and I think any attack on any journalist of whatever persuasion, from whoever, I think must be taken up. And I think if you make that simple progress along that track, I think it'll really work.
Vinay, I want to come to you with the second problem, and this was part of the statistics I was calling out, and that's the lack of convictions in these cases, where if the people who shoot at journalists and run away are never caught, there is almost this sense of impunity, that it's so easy to get rid of a journalist today.
Yes, and I think there are two very important differences which we must point out. Number one, losing a life as a journalist as part of collateral damage that may happen if I'm covering a riot or if I'm close to a spot which is a hostility is my occupational hazard. But if it's a targeted killing, it's an act of crime. It's an act which is anti-democratic. And in that condition, even if there is no death resultant, even if somebody has been threatened with violence as a journalist or has been threatened with death, that's where the governance of the day needs to step up to show decisive action to suggest that democratic institutions need to be protected and this cannot be tolerated. And the only thing I wanted to add is, do keep in mind that there is a commonality of narrative currently. Facts are enemies of propaganda.
Yes.
And the minute you have a larger system or a larger environment of propaganda, the targeting of people who are supposed to bring in facts will rise. And that is why you will see that not just journalists, but even fact bringers like RTI activists have also been targeted. In state after state, you will see a lot of RTI activists are being targeted. So here you have a problem where there is when there is a targeted killing, there is a concerted effort to silence or threaten people who are supposed to be bringing facts so that propaganda can rule the day.
Right. I saw Mr. Jyoti Malhotra put up his hand as well. Mr. Malhotra, if you had something to add to that, please go ahead. And Vinay is very right. When there's a journalist going to the border to cover something and that person is taking on a conscious risk, saying I'm going to put myself at risk, is different from when there's a targeted shooting in the manner we saw yesterday. How can we stop this, Mr. Malhotra? Okay. Sorry, Rahul Jalali. Go ahead, Mr. Jalali.
Yes. Oh, well, you were asking me. I thought
Yes.
you were asking Jyoti that. But I think what's important is because I have been president of the Press Club of India and also chairman of the Federation of Press Clubs of India. So what I've noticed is that a lot of attacks on journalists go unnoticed by journalist community themselves. And I'm talking of attacks which are really gory, and they take place in small towns and small villages of our country. Wherever there is a journalist who is pursuing truth, whatever it might be, I mean, which means exposing all those who are deal makers locally, that journalist is under threat. There have been killings of journalists in Uttar Pradesh and brutal killings of journalists in Madhya Pradesh. And one thing I've noticed over the last 6-7 years, that the attacks on journalists are not just mere attacks, but physically they're annihilated. And the manner in which these attacks take place, like let me give you some of the instances. In Bareilly, Uttar Pradesh, 2 years ago, a local journalist who was exposing the land mafia, was tied up by chains to a motorcycle and dragged through the streets of Bareilly till he died. Again, a journalist who was again exposing the land mafia in Madhya Pradesh, his body was cut into pieces and burned, and that burned body was deposited in the neighboring state of Chhattisgarh. These things used to come to us in Delhi, and what I've seen is that the kind of reluctance of a lot of my peers in Delhi, my co-workers, to protest about them. What we react to when a journalist in a big city or a big name gets targeted, I don't condemn that. I think we should all be reacting to that. Secondly, I feel there is no body today of journalists. The unions are dead. There is no one to take up the case. That's why we at the Press Club were forced into something which is not our mandate. So I think we have to create a body, need greater unity, and third, which I think is the crux of the matter, is what kind of journalism are we doing today? I think we also need to look at it, the structures of ownership, the kind of reporting we do or we don't do, because reporting is dead today. We have more opinions rather than reportage. So these things have to be looked into. If we are losing our craft, well, we expose ourselves to what is happening, and we expose those reporters who are actually working as journalists and working in small towns. I think to begin with, this is what we need to do, is also examine ourselves before we point fingers at others.
Arthi Charaj, in your opinion, and Vinay Tiwari pointed out that there needs to be a certain strong reaction from establishment, from government when something like this happens, to show that they don't support this sort of thing. In your opinion, has the government reaction, both state and centre, been adequate in the case of Mr. Bukhari?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister still hasn't spoken up. It's been more than 24 hours since Shujat was killed, but we have not heard a single word of condemnation from the Prime Minister. And I think that this is really essential. It's essential that the Prime Minister speaks up, because this killing is not just him exposing a land mafia and therefore the mafia sort of hitting back by killing him, but this is a killing which strikes at the heart of the Prime Minister's new policy in Kashmir, where he's obviously trying to create a peace constituency through the ceasefire that was ordered through the month of Ramzan. So I mean, it is really important that condemnation comes from the highest level, which we tragically have not seen so far, about Shujat. But the thing is that you look at what's happening today on social media over the last few years, the way journalists are trolled, the kind of language that is used against journalists who have a difference of opinion with the current dispensation. I mean, there are threats of rape, there are threats of violence, there are threats of abuses of the filthiest kind against women, against male journalists. And we even had a union minister call journalists prostitutes. Now you tell me, I mean, if this is the kind of legitimacy that you are going to give to to abuse against journalists, is it any wonder that somebody just picks up a pistol one day and decides to go and shoot down a Gauri Lankesh in front of a house, or a Shujat Bukhari outside his office? So I mean, I think somewhere there has to be, yes, I mean, it has to work on two levels. One, I think journalists need to definitely come together in a much stronger manner and condemn, not just when a journalist is killed, but even this kind of a trolling and abuse that goes on of journalists on social media. And I think that we as a journalist, as a community, have not done enough to condemn this. We've not made it into a big enough issue which forces the government to act against people who, sort of abuse us the way they do on social media. So that's one. But I think there also has to be a political reaction against this, because after all, freedom of the press is one of the pillars of democracy. And if journalists are going to be silenced, particularly journalists who speak the voice of reason, who, are moderate like Shujat was, then if journalists are going to be silenced, then you're endangering democracy itself. So I think that, the political community also has to come together on this and work with journalists to see what can be done to protect the freedom that we have,
yes,
the freedom of press.
Actually, Aarti ji brings up a really good point. And now that our entire panel is here, Jyoti Malhotra is also with us, Manisha Priyam is also with us. Here's the question I want to ask, and I do believe, and for the senior journalists on the panel, all of my seniors who are on the panel, this will seem like a really daft question to ask at this point, but I'm going to ask it anyway. A lot of people think that when a journalist asks questions or questions a government, that we are anti-government or anti-BJP or anti-Modi or anti-Congress or anti-Aam Aadmi Party. My question is this: isn't it a journalist's job to fundamentally question those in power, whoever is in power? Tomorrow the government will change, that same journalist will have to question the next government. That doesn't change. It is the definition of the job to question the government of the day. Manisha Priyam, there seems to be a misunderstanding in our country right now that journalists are taking sides, but actually it is a journalist's job to be anti-establishment. Is that not true?
Yeah, it's quite true. I mean, democracy is actually a very rational and scientific system. The freedom of the press is meant to, in fact, enhance critique, not just critique. It's supposed to present what is called mathematically the counterfactual. The truth to power, in other words, is to be presented by journalism. Now, at a time when the revolution in information, the penetration of media networks through the electronic medium should have led to more of the information and more of the questioning, what we can see is exactly the opposite. So in a sense, it's this whole thing about the explosion of information with the lack of an ideology, that's kind of leading to the trolls that my preceding panelist has been talking about. But more importantly, those who are in power in a democracy around the world, there is a trend that they seem to be attacking journalists. They think of journalists as people shorn of power. Now every time there is a big effort by journalists around the world to come back with more evidence of the kind of people, I would say, very undeserving people coming to power in the biggest democracies or the newer ones like Russia. Whenever they are challenged back, look at the way they respond. And what has happened to Shujat is extremely unfortunate, extremely unfortunate. If you look at the Indian scenario, I definitely feel that the state level, the worsening state level law and order scenarios have left journalists who work particularly with state level political issues in mind and pursue them very, very vulnerable. While at the all India level there may be trolling, but at the state level journalists are actually in fear of life. I mean, I travel to Gulbarga now. One of the first things that if you meet the people in the district, they'll tell you, oh, this was the land of Ramesh Kalburgi. And what was Kalburgi doing? He was a journalist and a social activist. So this mold of being a journalist and a social activist at the level of the locality, at the level of the district, and in domains of the state level is an extremely endangered profession. And I do think that all India bodies of journalists need to understand that they have their fellow professionals working in these arenas. And how do we take it up as an all India question? How do we pose it now as a new question for democracy, as a new counterfactual, that the moment there's somebody who's likely to pose the rule of reason to state level political scenarios, they are endangered for life. I mean, look at this. What do you fear? Somebody talking about an idea, you want to shoot the idea with a gun? I mean, this is the worst possible form of people's rule that one could think about. At the moment you open your mouth, you're likely to be shot at. And I think the timing of it all is extremely unfortunate. The gentleman walks out of his office for the iftar party at the end of the holy month of Ramzan when Eid is almost there. And this is the way that we see the entire thing turn out in an extremely unfortunate way. So extremely unfortunate. Journalists of all shades of opinion raised actually to an international
Vinay,
level,
here's my question to you.
The
police have come out in Kashmir today and said categorically this is an act of terror, this is an act of terrorism. But it has all of the trappings of an act of an assassination because he was being targeted. So do you think that it had to do with the state of Jammu and Kashmir, or was it must have had something to do with the fact that he was a journalist and with the work he was doing?
Absolutely. And I think, look, I frankly don't want to fall into this trap of nomenclature because that's where the problem starts. The minute you start labeling it as, oh, it's an act of terror and hence it is a little less important than say something else, I think you've lost the plot there already. It's a targeted killing. Now, whether it's a targeted killing of a Gauri Lankesh in Bangalore or it's a targeted killing of Shujat Bukhari in Srinagar, it is a targeted killing. And when you are when anybody is indulging in targeted killing, you are indulging in an act of terror. For me, the person who actually shot Gauri Lankesh is as much a terrorist as somebody who may be belonging notionally to another organization, whichever part of Kashmir or outside Kashmir they may belong to. It's an act of terror no matter which part of the country you do, because you've chosen your target and you've killed that target for reasons, which simple reason of disagreement over ideology or disagreement over what he or she may bring to the table as a fact.
So not only have you shut that one voice, you've also sent fear and terror into the hearts of everybody else who might have a story to tell or an opinion to voice, and that is, like Vinay said, an act of terrorism. Jyoti Malhotra, what do we need to do in our country today to keep journalists safer, to protect our democracy?
That's a big question, Faye, and I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that question. I think I've been a journalist all my life for more than 30 years, and the only thing I know to do is to write my story. And I think that's what journalists have to do, is to write their stories day after day and to speak truth to power. And that's what Shujat Bukhari was doing. And I think that's what is so frightening about his murder, his assassination, his targeted killing, whatever you want to, however you want to describe it, is that, you know, he wasn't a star in that sense. He was an editor, a journalist who just did his job every day. And I think it's the ordinariness of him, of people like us who all we want to do is to write our stories, give both sides of the picture. But I do want to also pick up from where Aarti left off earlier, which is to say that that the press is a pillar of our democracy. It's still a fairly young democracy, and if journalists who bring you the news, if we are going to be targeted, then I'm afraid it's going to damage our democracy. And look at the number of people in the government today who have spoken up, some of who have and some of who haven't. So let's ask ourselves, why is it that the condemnation has come from some quarters and hasn't come from others? And perhaps if we were all united in our condemnation, that would send a much bigger message to those who want to silence us. And I think that's the heart of this problem, is that some of us want to silence us and some say, okay, you go out there and do your work. So I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. Yes, we will speak truth to power, like Shujat Bukhari did day after day after day for several years of his life. All of us will continue to do that, or many of us will continue to do that. But why is it that this insecurity that now could breed or could begin to breed in the heart of our profession? What do we do about that? So it's a big question, Faye, and I'm not sure I have anything else to say.
Well, the other question we have to ask, and of course, Gohar Jilani has not spoken yet. Mr. Jilani, go ahead. In your view, do you believe India has become less safe for journalists in the last 2 years?
First of all, my name is Gohar Gilani, not Gohar Jilani. Having said that, it's okay. I will restrict my comment to what happens to journalists in Kashmir, especially in a conflict zone. When you report or file your stories, what dangers there are as a journalist. Journalists for the last 30 years in Kashmir have been soft targets for both state as well as non-state actors. And they have often found themselves as sitting ducks for both. And in the mid-90s, there were this renegades who were state-sponsored, and they would, every other day kidnap the leading prominent editors like Zafar Miraj, Bashir Manzar, and others who have been kidnapped and shot at. Some of them were shot at from close range, and they miraculously, survived. And this has been happening, and Shujat Bukhari, unfortunately, is the 5th journalist to fall in the line of duty. And before him, there was Parvaz Sultan, and there was others. There was a parcel bomb, attack in the office of Yusuf Jamil, who was then working for the BBC. So, the problem is, I'll just give you an example. For example, if a journalist from Kashmir brings out facts that there has been a human rights violation in South or North Kashmir or in any part of the Kashmir Valley by the armed forces, many anchors who now behave more as Fidain anchors, and they behave as stenographers and PROs for the government. They blame, the first thing they do is that they will blame that journalist of being on Pakistan's payroll or ISI's payroll, as to deny the facts on the ground. And if the same journalist brings out the fact of any atrocity committed by the militants, so then he will be labeled as an Indian agent. So these are the dangers for a journalist who brings out complete pictures and who brings out facts on the ground. He is either labeled as, even with Shujat Bukhari, you go through the timeline of his Twitter, many people in mainland India, the right-wing people, have labeled him as a Pakistan sympathizer, jihadi, and whatnot, and they somehow tweeted that he is being targeted by the same jihadi forces he was sympathizing with. And he was, this is the danger. And some people, targeted him by other labels. So that is how difficult it is for a journalist in a conflict zone to bring out a story. And this atmosphere in India right now, with the advent of new television channels and with all these 9-time primetime shows, this continuous demonization of Kashmiris as if they have no opinion of their own. Everything they say, everything they do is at the behest of someone. This caricaturing and demonization of Kashmiris, that they have nothing else to do. They're doing something because somebody is paying them, and that's the problem. Unless that changes and there is acceptance of Kashmir as a political dispute which needs a political resolution, I don't think things will change. And these kind of labels and demonization make journalists very, very vulnerable in a conflict zone like Kashmir.
Mr. Enram, do you agree that we're making journalists vulnerable right now because in the fraternity we're now questioning each other?
Well, that is bound to go on, some disagreements, but I want to pick up the point made by Aarti earlier, that this campaign of hate and trolling, I think there is a real correlation between that and what is happening, although it's hard to find any direct link. The point is made about Donald Trump's attack on the media, that this is weakening protection for journalists internationally. There's a point that has been made by many writers in the United States and elsewhere, that it's constant attack on the media, the failed New York Times, fake news and all that is really weakening the temper around the world and so on. But in India, this attack prostitutes and all that. I think there is a correlation between that, the hate, the toxicity of that, and the increasing vulnerability of journalists. I didn't know that in Kashmir there were so many casualties. We have to look at this list put out by the Committee for Protecting Journalists, CPJ, to see if any of that has been left out. But I don't think we should exaggerate the state. There are many areas where journalists are quite safe, but it is totally unacceptable that so many journalists have been killed, and the impunity, that's, I think, as bad as the killings and so on, that the system is simply unable to bring the criminals, the murderers to justice. Not a single case. You mentioned 48 of journalists killed since 1992, listed by CPJ. Of them, 34, including Shujat, have been murdered in the line of duty in connection with their work. Not a single case has reached finality when you talk about the criminal justice system. In some cases, a cover-up. In other cases, incompetence or the law's delays. But this, I think, this must end. And we have to own up. India is a founding and permanent member of this club of shame. We have been on this list from the beginning, from the time CPJ began to put out this annual Global Impunity Index, and India continues to be in this, and that's something shameful. And I think we have to expose this as part of this campaign to protect freedom of press.
Very well said. Aarti, Jarrad, I'm just going to pick up what Mr. Ram just said when he said, we don't have convictions. Out of the 44, 34 cases are still open. Even in the Gauri Lankesh case, where the SIT has now, after this much national media glare, has now claimed that they have found the person who pulled the trigger. Do you think they will ever find the person who gave the order? Because obviously it's not the person who pulled the trigger who had the motive. Will we ever get to the bottom of it?
No, in fact, what is so disturbing about what is happening with the Gauri Lankesh case is that, these, I think some 6 people have been identified and arrested by SIT. And, there are certain, there is a section with a certain kind of political persuasion which is finding excuses for these people, and who are trying to say that these people are being targeted and arrested because of this attempt to give a bad name to Hindu terror, to sort of create this fear about Hindu terror. So, where is the question of justice for Gauri when, the whole thing is getting politicized between the right wing and, the liberals, or, the different lobbies with different ideologies. And then they're fighting over who's behind Gauri Lankesh's killing. And, this lack of conviction is a very serious problem with our criminal system, criminal justice system in India. it's not just murder of journalists. You look at, I mean, most police departments, the CBI, I mean, their conviction rates are pathetic. It's like 2 to 10% in, you know, of convictions. So, you know, where is the question of journalists getting justice when, you know, other people can't get justice either? So, I mean, we need to seriously look at our criminal investigation system, our criminal justice system. I think the police, it needs serious overhauling. I mean, you tell me, if Gauri can be killed outside her house at 9 p.m. at night, you know, what is the safety and security that the police are providing to, you know, to ordinary people in the city of Bengaluru? And Shujat was killed in broad daylight, in the heart of Srinagar, in the press enclave. So, you know, and you know, this kind of killing is, you know, yes, Kashmir is a conflict zone, but this kind of daring killing in broad daylight in Srinagar is a rare occurrence in Srinagar. It happens outside Srinagar, but in Srinagar city itself, it's a rare occurrence. So somewhere, obviously, there is a laxity that is happening in security across the board, not just in conflict zones, but even in peaceful places like Bengaluru. So,
Yes.
I mean, I think all this needs to be looked at. But as far as we journalists are concerned, I think we must have a sense of community, and we must get together to fight for our protection and our right to question, our right to dissent, our right to speak our minds and write fearlessly. That is something we must do, and we should not get trapped into, you know, commercial competition and start backbiting and sniping at each other.
Very well said. I'm going to give the last word to Rahul Jalali. Mr. Jalali, the question of trolls, and there are a lot of people on Twitter and other social media who will say it's my freedom of expression to disagree with a journalist's point of view and to say what I feel. But there is a dotted line there with terms, you know, to the language that is used, the tone that is used, and perhaps in many cases, the blatant threats. Do you think it adds to the environment
Well,
of the lack of safety? Yes, please go ahead. I apologize.
Of course it does. Of course it does. Because, look, I've been told very often, and the kind of manner in which the threats come. I mean, someone will call me at dead of night and say, look, we are going to do X, Y, Z to you, or threaten my family, or all these things happen. But let's look at one thing. I think we've also got to look at the changing world. To be a good journalist, a certain amount of liberalism is necessary. But we are living in a world where authoritarianism is rising. We are also living in a world where religiosity is increasing ground. And they both are anti-liberal, anti-freedom of press. So this is the conflict. Now, within Indian democracy, I think it's time that we also have a new law to protect journalists. Look, our laws are outdated, they offer no protection, and specifically journalists. Also, increasingly, journalists are also becoming social activists today. Shujat is a prime example of that. So is Gauri. They both indulged in a certain amount of social activism. Now, if your conscience is clear, you will also do a bit of social activism because you want to achieve something for the people who live around you. This is necessary. You do it, Faye. But that is when the crunch comes. That's where you end up challenging authority. And the authority today brutalizes you in various ways. Trolling is one of them. But physical threat has also become a commonplace. Shujat was killed not only because he was a journalist, but because he was an active promoter of peace in the valley. So all those who were anti-peace killed him. Gauri was killed because she stood up for certain rights of people around her. So she was eliminated. Journalism, yes, plays a role. And these are the threats we all face. We all face. I don't know about you, Faye, but given the kind of journalism you do, obviously you will also be trolled and targeted. I think we need a new law. We have presented a draft of a new legislation to replace the outdated laws on journalism, like the press council is a dead body. You need to rework that. You need to have a new institution. The Working Journalist Act is dead. It protects no one. So we need a new law. I think that is essential. A law which doesn't only protect your jobs, but it also protects you physically. It protects you from being trolled. It protects you from people who come to kill you. I think these things are necessary. And finally, last but not the least, we all need to be together. I think unity is essential today amongst us. I think that's the crux of the matter.
Vinay, very last question.
That's the key.
Can I come in for 10 seconds?
Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make this point because, I think someone spoke before me that this was one of, the first attacks which happened in Srinagar. Most of the attacks, in Kashmir, which targeted journalists and editors have happened in Srinagar. Parvaz Sultan was killed almost in the same building. A parcel bomb attack in Yusuf Jamil's office happens in the same press enclave. Shujat Bukhari was killed in the same press colony. And before that, NDTV correspondent Zafar Iqbal in 2002 May was also targeted by unidentified gunmen. And he survived miraculously. So most of the attacks have happened in Srinagar. Just wanted to bring that fact,
Right.
That's it.
Aarti Gerard had something to say. Aarti, go ahead, please.
Yeah, and what I'll just add one line.
I'm glad that he enlightened me on this, because I was under the impression that this was a rare thing.
highly securitized area.
Yes.
Absolutely, Rahul sir.
Aarti,
No, Aarti, what I was saying is that these attacks took place in Press Enclave, which is a highly secure area.
Faye.
Aarti first and then Manisha ji.
No, precisely.
Go ahead. Yes.
So obviously there is some laxity somewhere. This is what I'm talking about, the general laxity in security, not just in conflict zones like Kashmir, but even if, a Gauri Lankesh can be shot dead at 9 p.m. outside our house in a place like Bengaluru, which is by no stretch of imagination a conflict zone.
Yes.
So obviously there is a laxity now in our whole approach to safety and security, which is, making journalists very vulnerable.
Manisha,
Apart from making common folk vulnerable, it's making journalists very vulnerable too.
Manisha,
for doing their job.
How much does...
Manisha ji, go ahead.
No. I think democracy has reached that stage where it fears an idea so much that ordinary people walking into their houses at 9 o'clock or walking out of their offices at 7 o'clock, doing their job with zeal and with an idea in their head, an ideology in their head, some idea of the society that they want to live in, so for the betterment of democracy. Simply that idea is responsible for them to be taken to the gun. I do think things have come to a pass, just that moment when powerful people are secured by the instruments of that state, the very idea, the criticism that makes the heartbeat of a democracy, that should be shot dead. I mean, we've really reached some kind of a pass. It's not just about law and order or deteriorating law and order. It's about society feeling that those with an idea now need to be killed so that some perverse idea of what they think is democracy and public order can be maintained.
Right. But
I think there's
a very quick question also to...
Can I quickly say?
Yes, my last question is this. We had Mr. Jalali talk about threats, Jyoti Malhotra. The truth is that when miners and builders and businessmen and smugglers and people in government get threatened or get insecure with the story that's coming out and the threats are issued, neither the police and very often journalists themselves don't take these threats seriously. How often have we had it that the police has taken a threat that a journalist received seriously? And perhaps is that one way to keep journalists safer in this country? Jyoti Malhotra?
No, I'm not sure about, well, of course, the police have to do their job and they have to take threats seriously. But really, I think Faye, Manisha made a really important point about how we have reached that stage in our democracy in India, where we are not able to, where we are confronted by an idea and we're afraid of that idea, and we're not able to discuss that idea non-violently. and that when we express a dissent, we have to do it with violence. And I think that's a really important point. That we are not, we are in the business of ideas, we are in the business of thoughts and of dissent, and the very fundamental aspect of democracy is dissent. And if people cannot accept dissent, then I think that's a really dangerous place in our democracy, which is why I'm asking the question, why is it that somebody like the Prime Minister himself has not condemned the murder of Shujat Bukhari? You know, it doesn't, so people will say, why should the Prime Minister do this, that and the other? After all, he's the Prime Minister, he's got lots of things to do. If the PM had done it, and I'm sure he's feeling badly about this, if he had just put out that one tweet, that message would go a long way. But the very idea that we cannot we cannot disagree with each other at the cost of hurting each other, I think that's a very important point that Manisha is making, is that dissent is no longer par for the course in India today.
Right. Unfortunately, I have run out of time, but I want to thank all of the panelists, all senior journalists, all of my seniors from the fraternity to have made time to be with us tonight on Mirror Now. I'm not, in conclusion, I'm not going to put out a massive, conclusion of this, because there's nothing left to be said after you have all spoken. I just want to remind our viewers that last night, after the assassination, we spoke with a colleague of Shujat Bukhari on the phone line from Rising Kashmir, and he said, we will continue to tell the truth. Inshallah, we will continue to tell the truth. That's what we're going to do. The journalists of this country will stand together. We will remember that Rabindranath Tagore dreamt of a country where the mind was without fear and the head was held high. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. So on the eve of Eid, as it's just been announced, and in the memory of Shujat Bukhari and all of the other journalists we have lost in the last couple of years, we will continue to tell the truth. Inshallah, we will continue to tell the truth. Thanks for watching.